Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bob Keyser. This is the Son of Man Urantia project. Today's episode is the final version of Chapter 18, Part 2, The 12 Apostles, from the book Son of Man Urantia. You can get your copy at the lulu.com bookstore. There's no editing on these posts, so if I make a mistake or one of the many animals around here wakes up, we just carry with it and go on through. Chapter 18, The 12 Apostles, Part 2. Almost, that is. Hold on a minute. Here we go. Honest Nathaniel. Nathaniel was the last of the original 6 apostles chosen by Jesus personally. When he and Philip met Jesus and the others on the road to Cana, he was 25 years old, making him the second youngest of the apostles after John Zebedee. He was also the youngest of his family of 7 siblings, who by this time had all died or married. Nathaniel was single and the only one of the children still living with his parents, who were old and weak and relied on his support. Nathaniel and Philip had entered a couple of business ventures in the past, and he was thinking about becoming a merchant to make his living. He was the best educated of the apostles, except for Judas Iscariot. It was the other apostles who gave Nathaniel his nickname that meant, more or less, that he was an honest, sincere man that would not trick a person when doing business. This was his most important virtue. His greatest shortcoming was his extreme pride in anything personal, like his city, family, nation, or reputation. Pride, like many traits, is only commendable to a certain point. After that, it becomes prejudice. This caused Nathaniel to be quick in prejudging people according to his personal opinions. For example, even before meeting Jesus, his first question to Philip was if anything good could come out of Nazareth. But with that said, Nathaniel was not stubborn, and he could change his mind like he did with Jesus as soon as he looked into his face. Nathaniel was the odd genius of the apostles. He was at once a dreamer and philosopher, but with a practical side. He could swing from being serious and intellectual one moment to telling jokes and stories the next. When at the top of his game, Nathaniel was the best storyteller of them all, and Jesus enjoyed talking with him, whether serious or not. Over time, Nathaniel gave importance to Jesus, his mission, and the kingdom of heaven, even if he never took himself seriously. The trait that Nathaniel most admired about Jesus was his tolerance, his generous sympathy, and broad-mindedness. With the exception of Judas Iscariot, Nathaniel was loved and respected by the other apostles. They all got along well. Judas's problem related to Nathaniel's attitude. He did not think that Nathaniel was taking his job seriously. At one point, Judas even went so far as to go to Jesus secretly and complain about Nathaniel. After listening to Judas, Jesus scolded him a bit, saying, "Judas, be careful and watch your step. Do not over-magnify your office. Who of us is competent to judge his brother? It is not the Father's will that his children should only do the serious things in life. Let me repeat, I have come that my family in the flesh may have more abundant joy, life, and happiness. Go and do the work that has been entrusted to you, and do it well, but leave Nathaniel, your brother, to make his account with God." Judas had too much pride. and he did not appreciate being chastised by Jesus. This memory of those and many other events continued to taint Judas's heart right up until the end. There were many times when Jesus was away on the mountain with John, Peter, and James that issues between the other apostles would become heated to the point that even Andrew was not sure how to relieve the tension. It was times like this when Nathanael would come up with a flash of good humor or a bit of appropriate philosophy to bring everything back to balance. Nathanael's job was to take care of everyone's families. This meant he could not attend all of the conferences between Jesus and the apostles, because whenever something happened, he would immediately have to leave, go to that home, and handle the problem. Nathanael performed his duties well, and all of the others rested securely, knowing that their families were safe in his hands. After Pentecost and the death of his father, Bartholomew, Nathanael left for India and Mesopotamia, baptizing believers and spreading the good news of the kingdom of heaven. He was not part of organizing the religion that arose after Jesus was killed, and none of the others ever knew what happened to their poet, humorist, and philosopher. But Nathanael was a remarkable man in the kingdom and did much to spread Jesus' teachings before he died in India. Matthew Levi. Matthew, chosen by Andrew, was the seventh apostle. He came from a family of taxmen and was himself a customs collector in Capernaum, where he lived. Matthew was married, 31 years old, and had 4 children when he joined the group. Jesus never gave Matthew a nickname, but before long, the others started to call him the money getter, or something to that extent. Matthew was moderately wealthy, the only one of the apostles who was. He was a good businessman and naturally gifted with the ability to make friends and get along well with many different types of people. Because of these traits, Andrew put Matthew in charge of their finances. He was the apostles' spokesman when it came to raising money from the wealthier citizens. Matthew was a good judge of human nature and did well at marketing. He was intense, sincere, and continually grew in his belief in Jesus and the certainty of the kingdom of heaven, even though his duties finding money meant he was not in on all of the best of Jesus' talks to the others. Matthew's strong point was his complete devotion to the cause. He was intensely loyal to Jesus and devoted to his job of filling the treasury. Matthew was overwhelmed that he, a taxman, had been accepted by Jesus and the apostles. Still, it took the other apostles some time to get used to the idea of having a publican in their group. This was especially true with Simon Zealous and Judas Iscariot. Matthew persevered despite his past, and in time all of the apostles became proud of him and his efforts for the kingdom. Matthew's weakness was being short-sighted and materialistic, although these traits lessened as time progressed. What Matthew most admired about Jesus was his forgiveness, and he constantly kept in mind the fact that faith was the only thing needed to enter the kingdom of God. For Matthew, and this was how he told it to the others, he was now in the business of finding God. Matthew was one of the apostles who took notes on Jesus' lessons, and these were the basis of Isidore's later account that became known as the Gospel according to Matthew. Over the ages, Matthew's life as a businessman and tax collector has led many thousands of other politicians and public officials into the kingdom of heaven. Matthew's presence among the 12 kept the doors of the kingdom wide open to masses of outcast and downhearted souls who thought they had long since lost any saving grace and Jesus never turned even one away. Well, Matthew freely took donations from Jesus' disciples and others who came to hear Jesus speak. He never went out in public asking for money. Most of his fundraising was done in secrecy, and he received most of the money from a small group of wealthier believers in the kingdom. Over time, Matthew also used all of his own savings to support the apostles, but they never knew about this because he did not tell them. He was worried they would think his money was tainted. Instead, he donated his money in someone else's name. And there were times when rather than going out and asking for money, he stayed and listened to Jesus' teachings, knowing he had to make it up out of his own pocket. Matthew never did let the other apostles know that it was his money keeping them fed most of the time. He kept it secret, even though he was more or less on probation with the others at the start of the mission, and he wanted them to know all that he was doing for the cause. And of course, his heart burned to let Jesus know about all of this, little realizing that Jesus was already aware of Matthew's efforts and generosity. When the persecutions began and everyone had to flee Jerusalem, Matthew headed north preaching the gospel and baptizing believers in Syria, Thrace, Galatia, Bithynia, Cappadocia, and none of the other apostles ever knew what became of him. In Thrace, at Lysimachia, a group of unbelieving Jews conspired with the Romans to kill him, and Matthew died confident in his faith in God. Thomas Didymus. Chosen by Philip, Thomas was the eighth apostle. He was married, 29 years old, and had 4 children. In the past, he had been a carpenter and stonemason, but when he joined the apostles, he was fishing out of Tarichea, a small village on the west bank of the Jordan, where it flows out of the Sea of Galilee. Thomas was not well educated, but he was the leading citizen of his town. Coming from excellent parents who lived in Tiberias, he had the only truly keen and analytical mind of the 12. This was Thomas's most impressive strength. He was the real scientist of the apostles, logical and skeptical. But while he has been known as Doubting Thomas, the apostles hardly saw him as a trifling skeptic with his courageous loyalty. Thomas's home life as a child was not good. His parents were not happy being married, and this affected Thomas's adult life. He tended to be disagreeable. As a matter of fact, even his wife was glad to see him join the apostles, happy that her pessimistic husband would be away from the house most of the time. Thomas was also suspicious, and this was his Achilles tendon. In the beginning, Thomas made Peter so mad that he went to his brother Andrew and complained that Thomas was mean, ugly, and always suspicious. But as the apostles grew to know Thomas, they liked him more. He proved himself to be superbly honest, sincere, courageous, and unflinchingly loyal. Still, he had grown up a real pessimist and found fault in almost everything. By the time Thomas became an apostle, he had lost most of his faith in humanity, and his superb mind had become cursed with suspicion. But once he met Jesus, his disposition began to transform for the better, even though he never overcame his mistrust throughout his life on earth. Andrew assigned Thomas to manage the itinerary, and he performed these duties well. He was a good executive and an excellent businessman. But Thomas was also handicapped by his different moods. He would be one man one day and another man the next, even if he did improve over time. Jesus enjoyed his long personal talks with Thomas. Being one of the apostles, he was an immense comfort to an being one of the apostles, he was an immense comfort to all honest doubters and proof that Jesus loved them despite their doubts. Thomas encouraged many troubled minds to come into the kingdom, even though he could not understand all of Jesus' spiritual and philosophical teachings. Thomas revered Jesus because of his matchless symmetry and superbly balanced character. The fact that Jesus was so just, yet so merciful. Thomas admired that Jesus was firm, but never obstinate, calm, but never indifferent, tender, but never vacillating, positive, but never rough or rude, strong, but at the same time gentle, pure and innocent, but at the same time virile, humorous and playful, but free from levity and frivolity, truly courageous, but never rash, forceful, or foolhardy, helpful and sympathetic, but never meddlesome or dictatorial, and a true lover of nature, but free from all tendency to revere nature. Intellectually, Thomas probably appreciated Jesus more than any of the 12. In the discussions between the apostles, Thomas was a conservative. He was cautious and focused on safety first. He would debate something as being foolhardy and presumptuous to the bitter end, but if Andrew put it to a vote and he lost the argument, he was the first to say, "Let's go," and fearlessly head out to do whatever had been decided. Time and again, Thomas would argue against Jesus exposing himself to danger. But if Jesus decided to do so anyway, it was always Thomas who rallied the other apostles by saying, "Come on, men, let's go and die with him." Thomas was a good loser. He did not hold grudges. Thomas was in some respects like Philip, in that he always wanted to be shown. But Philip's outward expressions of doubt were analytical, not merely skeptical. As far as physical courage was concerned, he was one of the bravest among the 12. Thomas had some bad days. He could be moody and downcast at times. He had lost his twin sister when he was 9 years old, and this sadness added to his temperamental problems later in life. When Thomas would get melancholy, Peter, Nathaniel, and many times one of the Alphaeus twins would help bring him out of it. In the beginning, Thomas received permission from Andrew to go off by himself for a day or two. But he quickly learned that when he was down, it was best to stick to his work and to stay around his friends. Unfortunately, when he was depressed, he would also try to avoid Jesus. But Jesus knew all about this and understood why he was harassed by doubts and occasional times of depression. Regardless, no matter what occurred in his emotional life, Thomas kept right on being an apostle, and it was always him who would be the first to say, "Let's go." Thomas is the heroic example of a person who has doubts, faces them, and wins. He was not a harping critic, and he had an impressive mind. Thomas was logical, and because the acid test for Jesus and became the acid test for Jesus and his fellow apostles. If Jesus and his work had not been true, it would not have held Thomas from the start to the finish. He had a keen and sure sense of fact, and no tolerance for anything but fact. He would have walked away at the first sign of fraud. Know this: while today's scientists may not understand Jesus and his work on earth, There was a man who lived and worked with Jesus and the others who had the mind of a true scientist, Thomas Didymus, and he believed in Jesus of Nazareth. Thomas had a hard time during the days of the trial and crucifixion. For a while he despaired, but he rallied his courage, stuck to the apostles, and was with the rest of them to later welcome Jesus on the Sea of Galilee. Thomas gave the apostles good advice after the Pentecost, and when the persecution scattered the believers, he went to Crete, Cyprus, Sicily, and the North African coast, baptizing believers and preaching the kingdom of heaven until the Romans caught and killed him in Malta. Thomas had just started writing his story of the life and teachings of Jesus a few weeks before he died. Judas and James Alphaeus. Judas and James, the sons of Alphaeus, were twins living and fishing near Carestia. They were married at 26 years old, with Judas having 2 children and James 3. The 9th and 10th apostles brought into the group, they were chosen by John and James Zebedee. There is not much to be said about Judas and James. They were 2 commonplace fishermen. They loved Jesus, and he loved them, but they almost never asked him questions. Judas and James Alphaeus could not understand much of what Jesus taught, and pretty much stayed out of the religious debates that went on between the other apostles. That said, they were ecstatic to find themselves numbered among such a mighty group of people. Judas and James were almost identical in mentality, appearance, and spiritual perception. What is said of one can be recorded for the other. Andrew assigned Judas and James to be in charge of all of the people that came to hear Jesus speak. The common folk were encouraged to see 2 people like themselves honored as apostles, and this alone brought many faint-hearted believers into the kingdom. They also appreciated that it was 2 ordinary people like themselves acting as the official ushers, telling them what to do. Judas and James were in effect the expediters for the 12. They helped Philip with the supplies, took money to the families for Nathanael, and were always ready to help out as needed. Judas and James were also called Lebbaeus. Damn it, Bob. Lebbaeus and Thaddeus. They had no strong or weak points. There was nothing outstanding about either of them. They did not have the same mental power as the others. They knew it, and they were actually happy about it. The other apostles gave these 2 nicknames, all in fun, that pretty much meant that they were average, ordinary, and commonplace guys. The twins were good-natured and simple-minded helpers, but they were also kind, faithful, and generous. Everybody loved them. Jesus took them on as apostles because he did not look down on a lack of talent, just evil, and making it sin. Judas and James were like many other fair-minded people on his worlds of time and space. When Jesus refused to allow a certain rich man to become an evangelist unless he sold his goods to help the poor, and yet the people saw that the twins were apostles, they were then certain that Jesus was no respecter of persons. For Jesus, a person's status on any of the material worlds of time and space means nothing. Faith is all that matters. Only the kingdom of heaven could be built on such a fragile human foundation, and the twins were proud yet humbled to be included. For Judas Alphaeus, it was Jesus' dignity and humility that he admired the most. Jesus never tried to bring attention to himself, and that made a significant impression on Judas. For James Alphaeus, it was Jesus' simplicity that he admired the most. While the twins could not understand Jesus, they did feel the love bonding them together. They did not benefit much intellectually from their time with Jesus, but the spiritual experience they had was significant. They believed in Jesus, and they knew that they were sons of God with him in the kingdom of heaven. Judas and James Alphaeus served faithfully to the end, despairing with the others through the dark days of the trial and crucifixion. They never lost faith in Jesus, and except for John Zebedee, they were the first to believe in his resurrection. But the twins never did understand what was meant by establishing the kingdom of heaven here on earth. When the other apostles went out to continue their work, Judas and James returned home to their families, went back to fishing, and were honored and blessed for their 4 years of service with Jesus, a Son of God and the Creator of our universe. Simon the Zealot. Simon Zelos was the 11th apostle and was 28 years old when he was chosen by Simon Peter. He was capable, came from a good ancestry, and lived with his family in Capernaum. Simon was an agitator, and he had a bad habit of speaking without thinking. He had been a merchant in Capernaum before turning all of his attention to the Jewish patriotic organization, the Zealots. Simon was put in charge of organizing the recreation for the group, and he did well. He was a rebel by nature and a revolutionary by training. Simon had always leaned toward protest, but Jesus guided him on the path of eternal progression to truth and spirit. He was a man of intense loyalties with warm personal friendships, and he deeply loved Jesus. The one thing that Simon admired the most about Jesus was his composure. He was always calm, poised, and sure that he was right. Simon's strength was his ability to inspire people. When the apostles found someone that was unsure about entering the kingdom, they would send for Simon, and it usually only took them about 15 minutes to help the person see their salvation through faith in God. Simon's biggest weakness was that he was material-minded. Even though Jesus had many talks with him over the 4 years, Simon could not make the transition from being a worldly-based Jewish nationalist to a more spiritual view that included others in the kingdom. Jesus told him that it was proper to see the social, economic, and political orders improved, but then he would always add, "That is not the business of the kingdom of heaven. We must be dedicated to doing the Father's will. Our business is to be ambassadors of a spiritual government on high, and we must not immediately concern ourselves with anything but the representation of the will and character of the Divine Father who stands at the head of the government whose credentials we bear." This was all hard for Simon to understand, and it took him a long time to grasp even a part of Jesus' teachings. Still, Jesus was always patient with him. Jesus was not afraid to identify himself with skeptics, patriots, laborers, optimists, publicans, pessimists, politicians, businessmen, and philosophers. Well, Simon started out as a fearless revolutionary agitating people wherever he went. He eventually calmed down and became a powerful and effective preacher of peace on earth and goodwill among humanity. He loved to argue, and when it came to dealing with the legalistic minds of the educated Jews or the intellectual quibblings of the Greeks, the apostles always sent Simon. When the apostles were scattered from Jerusalem because of the persecutions, Simon was emotionally crushed and went into semi-retirement. He had given up his patriotic mission to follow Jesus, and then, after everything, he thought he had lost it all. It took Simon a few years, but he eventually aroused his spirits and went forth preaching the gospel of the kingdom of God. He first went to Alexandria, and then after working his way up the Nile, he went deep into the heart of Africa, preaching the gospel of Jesus and baptizing believers along the way until he died, a frail old man. Judas Iscariot. Judas Iscariot was the 12th apostle and was chosen by Nathanael. He was single and 30 years old. Judas was born in Kerioth, a small town in southern Judea. When he was a child, his parents moved to Jericho. Judas had worked for his father, who had several businesses up until Judas started following John the Baptist. Judas's parents were Sadducees, and when he joined John's disciples, they disowned him. Judas was trying to get a job drying fish on the lower end of the Sea of Galilee when Nathanael met him at Terachia. Judas was probably the best educated of the 12 and the only Judean of the apostles. He had no natural outstanding traits, but he did have culture and social training. Judas was a good thinker, but not always an honest thinker. He did not understand himself well, and at times lied to himself. Andrew made Judas the treasurer for the 12. He was well trained for the job and did his duties honestly, faithfully, and efficiently up until he betrayed Jesus. For Judas, there was not anything that he thought was special about Jesus. He could never get over his prejudice. He was a true Judean, and the rest of the apostles were just Galileans. While the other 11 looked on Jesus as the perfect man, the self-satisfied Judas would criticize him, not out loud, but in his heart, about many things. Judas actually thought that Jesus was timid and afraid to assert his power and authority. Judas was an excellent executive. He was a stickler for organization and could plan ahead. He had the tact, ability, patience, and devotion needed to manage the finances for an idealist like Jesus, to say nothing of dealing with the chaotic business methods of some of the apostles. None of the 12 ever criticized Judas. As far as they could tell, he was able, loyal, and educated, even if at times critical. To them, he was, in every sense of the word, a huge success for a person of that time. They loved Judas, and in all ways they considered him one of them. Judas was the only son of unwise parents. When he was young, he was pampered and spoiled. As an adult, he was conceited. Judas was a poor loser, and he had lax ideas of fairness. He could also be hateful or suspicious. Judas would make assumptions and misinterpret what his friends would do or say. And all of his life, he was in the habit of harboring grudges against those he thought had offended him. Taken altogether, his sense of values and loyalties was skewed. Judas must have believed in Jesus, but we doubt that he loved him with a whole heart. The situation with Judas illustrated the truth in saying that there is a way that seems right to a person, but in the end, it is death. The path to sin and death is a slippery slope. It is easy to be deceived when making peace with evil a little bit at a time. And no, money was not the motive for Judas's betrayal of Jesus. He was always financially loyal to his master and his fellow apostles. For Jesus, Judas was an adventure in faith. From the beginning, Jesus knew about Judas's weaknesses and the dangers of letting him into the group. But the sons of God in all universes give every created being a full and equal chance for survival and salvation. would occur to here on earth was not only about Judas. Jesus wanted the mortals on all of his other worlds of time and space to know that even when a Creator Son questions the sincerity and wholehearted devotion of the person to the kingdom, that they will be received. The door of eternal life is wide open to all. There are no restrictions or qualifications except for the faith of the one who wants to enter. This is the reason that Jesus let Judas go to the end, and why he always did everything possible to save and transform this weak and confused apostle. But when the light of God is not honestly received and lived up to, it tends to become darkness in the soul. In his mind, Judas grew intellectually from Jesus' teachings of the kingdom. But in his heart, he did not grow spiritually like did the other apostles. Judas had his feelings hurt many times, and he became more disappointed each day. He became suspicious and finally resentful of Jesus and the other apostles. In the end, he was obsessed with getting even if it meant betraying his master. These wicked and dangerous ideas took shape in Judas's mind when a woman, in gratitude, broke an expensive box of incense at Jesus' feet. And when Judas complained about the loss, Jesus swept his concerns aside in front of everyone. That was too much for Judas, and it brought forth all of his stored up hate, hurt, malice, revenge, prejudice, and jealousy that had been building up over his lifetime. Judas focused this evil side of his nature on the one innocent person in his entire life, Jesus. And in doing so, he chose death and darkness over the progressive kingdom of light. Jesus had, both publicly and privately, warned Judas that he was slipping. But divine warnings are mostly useless when dealing with an embittered human mind. Jesus did everything possible consistent with Judas's free choice of will to prevent him from choosing the wrong path. But when the critical test finally came, Judas, the son of resentment, failed. He gave into his evil side and let his pride, resentment, and desire for revenge take over his mind, and this quickly sent him into a pit of despair, confusion, and depravity. Judas formed his plan to betray Jesus and the others and quickly put it into action. There were times when he would have moments of shame and regret, but he would always defend his actions, thinking that there was still the possibility that Jesus would exert his power and save himself at the last moment. When the whole rotten plan was over and done with, this renegade mortal, who thought so little of selling out Jesus for 30 pieces of silver just to get even, went out and committed suicide to escape the reality of what he had done. The other 11 apostles were stunned and horrified, but Jesus just felt pity for his betrayer. The rest of the celestial host have found it hard to forgive Judas, and his name has become shunned across our entire universe. All right, everyone, that's it for chapter 18, the 12 apostles. Next up is chapter 19, the ordination of the 12. Defend liberty. Protect the innocent ones. Serve humanity for nothing more or less than the sake of God. Godspeed, everybody. Bobby Keyser, out here.